Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and this week I have the privilege to sit down with Martin Matishak. Martin has been doing some phenomenal writing, goes after stories that most are not covering, or if they are covering it, he always tends to find an interesting and relevant angle that others haven't necessarily seen. He's currently with The Record, previously had written for Politico, as well as I was just reminded, the National Journal before that. So really excited to have Martin sit down with us today and really excited about the discussion. Martin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
So, Martin, we're going to have some of your stories up on the screen, but I thought we'd start with the story that is everyone's story, and that's Salt Typhoon, as well as Volt Typhoon. And I don't mean to be cutesy, but each one of these in their own is a really bad storm. Collectively, I think it literally demonstrates a perfect storm in terms of concerns. But why don't we start with some of your reporting around Salt Typhoon, since it's most relevant?
Sure. So Salt Typhoon is the infiltration, if you will, of our telecom networks. There are up to 9 telecoms that have been impacted by this. Mm-hmm. We believe, or people I talk to believe, that number is going to go much, much higher. Mm-hmm. Not only the telecoms, but also some of the companies supporting the telecoms, connecting the telecoms, they might also be influenced. As bad as it sounds, infiltrating 9 telecom networks, it is traditional espionage in a lot of people's eyes, that they were after a certain type of person in a certain type of area, specifically DC, where we're sitting in this sort of area. And that's what they wanted to know: where they were, who they were talking to, and what they were texting. The universe gets smaller and smaller as you try and figure that out. So as bad as it really is traditional espionage as we think about pilfering information, data. However, I would say what changed about Salt Typhoon is it gave the Chinese, it showed them they could collect at an even deeper level. We have signals intelligence. We have the National Security Agency. That's where we get our foreign secrets from. This is a way they found that they can do this now. We can get that granular, that we can geolocate someone. We can read their texts. We can see who they're talking to. And I think that is a scary part of this. There's a lot of scary parts, but also another scary part is we don't know the full extent of it yet. The government still doesn't know the full extent of it. Now we're in the middle of a transition, and it could be, we might never know the full extent.
And the reality is when you think of critical infrastructure, not everything's equally critical, but you always thought the telcos were at the very top of the list. So it just makes you think about some of the other critical infrastructure owner-operators. It
does, and the telcos are unique because their technology stack is bizarre. Byzantine, I think, is the way someone described it to me once. Yes, yeah, I mean, I mean, this right there alone. So I mean, they're building, equipment on equipment on equipment for decades now, and they have all sorts of issues, not only about old tech, foreign tech in their systems. ID management is a big problem, and there's just so many different ways, and I think there's going to be a real question about the access that was gained, and are they ever truly, the Chinese ever fully, truly out of these networks?
The exfil, and you bring up, I mean, it is traditional espionage, which is very different than the intent when we're going to talk about Volt Typhoon, which in some ways should be more disconcerting.
Volt Typhoon is norm breaking. I mean, that's the way that many Biden administration officials talked about it, was that it broke the norms. It went beyond surveillance or IP theft, things like that. This is pre-positioning in our networks to
which has no espionage value, no financial value.
Exactly. For the purpose of catastrophe. It could be, they could set up a catastrophic series of events. And so there's no value in that, like you said. So that should be more concerning. And that's another instance where it's like, are they out? Will we ever know they're out? They were living off the land for potentially months before this. Are they still living off the land? Can they regain their access? If we kick them out, could they regain their access some other way? There's a lot of questions about that, but I would say Volt Typhoon, as bad as Salt Typhoon was, as we've discussed, Volt Typhoon really is like, it has people aghast at like what could happen here.
And especially the intentions.
Yes.
And I think we've all known that cyber intelligence preparation of the battlefield has occurred for a long time. What we didn't necessarily know is not only do you have a foothold, but you have a beachhead into some of those at the time of their choosing.
Exactly.
And I think what made Volt a little unique is also some of the targets themselves, wastewater.
Yeah.
Guam.
Yeah.
So clearly indicative of some of their intentions.
Some of their intentions and also some of their craft, if you will. I mean, looking at edge devices, like going back to your water example, there might be one person in charge of 20 water districts in the state of Kansas, and he does it all on his phone because that's all his department can afford is just to have him. He can't have 20 people out there.
And may have 5 other jobs on top of that.
Exactly. Exactly. He might be a part-time employee, but he has this device, and if that device is not secure, then all of a sudden, boom. So I think it really exposed edge devices in our critical infrastructure, and I think that's why you're seeing people like looking at the whole totality, the tech stack, because where are the weak points, and edge devices when it comes to Volt Typhoon is a big one.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I mean the intentions here do matter. I mean not all hacks are the same. Hackers differ. Obviously the tactics, techniques, and procedures they engage in differ. And here when you look at how do you think this fits into the broader Communist Party of China's strategic plan?
What it says to me is that in the past few years we've seen a lot of ramp ups from DOJ, FBI. Saying, we've taken down this bot network, we've taken down this hacking group. You've seen Cyber Command, NSA share essentially TTPs with the public, CISA share TTPs with the public. And what it says to me is all
tactics, techniques, and procedures. Most of our viewers will know that, but in case there are a couple that don't.
But what it says to me is that despite all of that, across all those agencies and all of those different kinds, including let's throw Treasury in there, sanctions, all of that has not been enough to change China's calculus when it comes to cyber. They will do what they want to do when they want to do it, and they are not scared by anything we've done to them so far. And I mean, the Volt Typhoon, even more than Salt Typhoon, which we talk about as espionage, but Volt Typhoon shows plain as day that sure, you can hit us on the nose with a newspaper, but we're going to still get in your house.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And I know you haven't written a whole bunch about Silk Typhoon, but at the end of the day, you mentioned sanctions, and it just seems to me, surprise, that some of the entities that are responsible for promulgating these sanctions might have been hit as well.
Yeah, and I think when
OFAC and
exactly, and I think when that comes out, when more is revealed about that, I think that'll also show more traditional espionage. They want to know what these people were thinking. It makes me think about Secretary Blinken, former Secretary Blinken's email being hacked because they want to know what he was thinking, who he was talking to, things like that. That to me is espionage. Right now, we could find out that they were trying to
do something else,
plant something in OFAC systems, things like that, like something that could flag if one of their people were about to be on there or something like that. But right now, that also strikes me as espionage.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there is a big issue, and not one we're going to have a whole lot of time discussing, but the whole question about signaling and what do we have lines in the silicon or red lines or which I do think we do need to differentiate espionage, CNE, computer network exploit, from attack, which would clearly be where Volt Typhoon intentions lie. And I think we do have to get to the point where we at least start defining some of those, not necessarily in 10 commandments etched in stone, but something that at least does have. Otherwise, our adversaries are going to continue to get as close to the line as they can.
I agree 100%.
And that line keeps moving. It's sort of like if you're in the red zone, you want to punch it through, but if it keeps going on forever, you're never going to.
Yeah, agreed.
So what about FCC? You've written a little bit about some of the potential in terms of regulations there, and I know we've got a Chevron deference world and where regulations fit in and all this. But
Sure.
what were some of your findings there? And I think they were specific to obviously Salt Typhoon.
To Salt Typhoon, yes. So the FCC is. So let's be clear. Let's start top level. There is no clear government response yet. There's no one silver bullet. Everyone's about to try a lot of things. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the top Democrat on Senate Intel, he's trying to get a bipartisan bill that would and put more regulations on critical infrastructure, including telecoms, which are kind of both. The SEC voted in some new rules in the last week of the Biden administration. With the FCC, what lawmakers did with the FCC is there was a program that is essentially known as Rip and Replace. It started during the first Trump administration. It's supposed to be about $5 billion to rip out old Chinese tech. It was ideally with Huawei was in mind when this started. It got 1.9-ish billion to start, and then it just sort of set fallow for a while. So when Salt Typhoon, Yes, Salt Typhoon.
Salt.
Sorry.
Yep.
So many typhoons.
Lots of typhoons, yeah.
So when Salt Typhoon came out, people were said this might be one way to potentially address that tech stack, is let's get rid of all this old tech and put in U.S.-made stuff that we trust. And so the last defense bill that was signed into law authorized $3 billion for that, which is what advocates were calling for. They're like, for about $3 billion, we can,
including me. Yeah.
Exactly. We can redress this. So that's in the NDAA, and that work was probably going to start this year.
Yeah, and I think it does beg a bigger set of questions around supply chain and whether or not we have visibility into our supply chains and what all that. I mean, rip and replace is a last resort, but at the end of the day, if you don't know what's in your system, you don't know what's in your system. It's sort of like, I like to look at what's on what I'm eating, and I like to know what the ingredients are, but we don't necessarily have that for cyber, do we?
Right, and in terms of the things I laid out, the Warner effort, the SEC, this is like the most easy, tangible to wrap your head around. Like, oh, that makes sense when you say what it does, and why haven't we addressed this? Like going to your food analogy, like why don't I know what's in my meal?
Exactly.
Like I should know. We should know what's in. We should know what's in these tech stacks. So if we don't, that should go away. Yeah.
I do think you'll see some activity around that, but it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
I did lead an initiative for the government. Just getting visibility is hard.
Yeah. And it's going to put, especially now that the Republicans have a trifecta here in Congress and on Capitol Hill and in the White House, being tough on China, but also being anti-regulation, which the Republicans traditionally are. So you can talk a big game about, we got to drive them out of our system, things like that. We got to strike back. But it's like, okay, well, that might include regulation. That might have to be an arrow in the quiver. And I just don't know how many Republicans are there yet on this, despite the seriousness of the Typhoon hacks.
Yeah, no, well said. And I don't see them as mutually exclusive, but I do think you raise a really good point there strategically. Let's jump to, you've also done some great reporting around military issues and cyber. I think there are three big issues that you've written on that are obviously on the tops of a lot of people's minds, and first being sort of Cyber Command 2.0 and sort of interesting timing at the very bottom of the ninth inning. You're dropping some key findings, but also one that I think we'll be talking about for quite some time, and that is looking at whether or not we need a cyber force. And then finally, sort of an age-old set of questions, and that's dual hat of NSA-Cyber Command. But let's start with Cyber 2.0, with Cyber Command 2.0.
Sure. So thanks for teeing up the question, because I think, I've covered Cyber Command for the better part of a decade now, and I think we're about to hit some of the most consequential years of the command's history in the next year or two even. So Cyber Command 2.0 is kind of this umbrella term that the command gave to a lot of homework it got from Congress. Congress was sending them a lot of demands about readiness, about personnel, about acquisitions, about things like that. So there are all these unfulfilled reports, and the former chief of Cyber Command and NSA, Paul Nakasone, was like, why don't we just sort of put under this big term, Cyber Command 2.0, and map out the next 10 years of what this command is going to look like. Let's just do that. And he wanted to be bold. So that work wrapped this year. It has not been shared publicly yet. It has not been shared, I don't think, even with the Hill just yet. But it was signed off on by Secretary Lloyd Austin. And essentially what it came down to was 5 recommendations for how Cyber Command could refigure itself to do business for the next decade. And I think one of them was a talent management task force, cyber warfare and innovation center, another sort of training center, and then something about readiness, because these cyber warriors are up 24/7 in cyberspace. Sometimes they're not as ready as they should be. People I talk to who are familiar with these conclusions, which again, those are the conclusions that we've reported out. They might have changed in the interim. We don't think so, but there's always that possibility. These changes, people I talk to say, are just changes in the margin. They are not revolutionary. And yes, their execution could improve things at Cyber Command, but if you're looking to like really
change the game,
this isn't you missed it. Like you whiffed. So, Cyber Command 2.0.
Good baseball analogy. You pulled that ninth inning. Like it.
And when do pitchers and catchers report? Like a few more weeks? Since I'm already not paying attention to the Super Bowl. But so besides sort of not really like being as impactful as people wanted, it was signed off on December 18th by the outgoing SecDef, and so like just about a month before Inauguration Day. Yeah. And if you're looking at how aggressive Trump and now Secretary Hesketh want to be about the military, this might not fly. That something was signed that essentially the 11th hour of a 4-year administration, they might say go back to the drawing board, or this isn't bold enough, or they might just say, good job, put it in a drawer somewhere and forget about it. It's really unclear. There's an implementation plan that's being drawn up right now. Secretary Hawk, General Hawk. General Hawk, the head of Cyber Command NSA today, he's leading that along with the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber, the acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. They're drawing that up, but we'll see that the proof will be in the pudding about whether this is actually changed and if this lasts beyond this new Trump administration, because they might say, this too little too late, fellas, like get rid of this.
And the proof will be in the pudding, and obviously lots of moving key personnel around different issues, but it does bring up a more revolutionary discussion, and that is around cyber force.
Yes.
And I think it's fair to say there's some momentum around this, and you've written about it, and Secretary Hegseth has weighed in on some of this, and very much so on the NSA Cybercom dual hat issue we'll discuss in a minute. But what are you hearing? What are you thinking? What are you writing on Cyberforce?
Sure. So Cyberforce, it seems like so proponents of setting up a separate cyber-specific service have tried for 2 years now to get a independent study conducted to say, is this feasible? Can we do this? Should we do this? The first year it was in the Senate defense bill, got taken out in conference, moved on. This past year, it was in both the House and Senate bills, but then the final compromise bill, it was massively watered down.
Weak tea,
Weak tea, that's a good way of putting it, because it went from looking specifically at a cyber force to cyber forces in the armed branches, and there's no deadline, so therefore who cares? No offense to the people working at the Pentagon, but I mean, like if you don't have a deadline, like
what's the point?
What's the point? But a few weeks ago, Congressman Morgan Luttrell out of Texas, a Republican, said that they're going to try again this year to add some teeth to that study and to accelerate it if they can, and try and get some sort of like give them some sort of deadline, like by the end of the calendar year or something, that to keep this going, because Congress, there are very large swaths of Congress that are just fed up with the lack of readiness of our cyber forces. And
those are legitimate arguments.
Those
Descriptively, I think there's a lot of there in that. The question is, prescriptively, is it the answer?
Exactly. I mean, as someone told me, this is a few years ago now, and I believe the numbers have gotten better. They're classified readiness numbers, so I wouldn't know them. And if I did, I don't know if I'd talk about them on a podcast. But, a few years ago, someone told me about, the Cyber Mission Force, which is about 6,000 personnel who do the offensive and defensive operations for Cyber Command. This person said that if the services were at the same readiness levels as the CMF, the Cyber Mission Force, planes would not fly, boats would not sail, soldiers would not march, Marines would not deploy. It was that bad, anemic numbers. And Congress is just kind of tired of the services giving short shrift to cyber, and they're saying that, either get your house in order, or we're going to look at this, and if this comes back positive, we're going to do this. We're going to move ahead and set up a new armed service. Yeah.
Well said. There'll be much more discussion about that on our podcast, as well as obviously in the halls of Congress, as well as the executive branch, and we're probably going to end up doing a issue brief of our own on some of what that looks like. I mean, not to lead the witness or even shape what my own thinking is, but at the end of the day, something does need to change. The question is it change for change's sake, or how do you find a way to maximize what it is you're trying to achieve? And I think the services have been laggard, and I don't think you can generalize. Not every service is the same. Navy's not exactly Air Force,
exactly, or the Army. The Army does it. The Army does
it pretty well.
The Army does it pretty well. But I mean, businesses
because it's a Title 10 mission, they do well.
Right.
Which tees up our next question. So,
but I would just say there is. I see proponents who say a cyber force. I understand there are people who say no cyber force because we've already been doing this certain way for so long, and to do that now, especially with China, the typhoons, this 2027 date for Taiwan, are we really going to unplug and replug everything in while we're supposed to be focusing on these big issues
in the middle of exactly. No, well said, and I think smart minds can disagree on all of those issues anyway. I'm slow to get to that answer yet. Not descriptively.
Sure.
I'm just not sure prescriptively it maximizes. Let's go to the other hot one right now, and there you have Secretary Hegseth weighing in on whether or not the dual hat of U.S. Cyber Command and NSA should be split. I think there's been a lot of discussion around this for a number of years, going back to the first Trump administration on some of these issues. So first, just help us frame the issue, and then and sort of the pros and the cons from your perspective. But maybe before we even do that, frame the discussion.
Sure. So I would say I'll lead off by saying this topic proves that time is a flat circle. True
that, yeah.
So when Cyber Command was stood up in, I believe it was 2010, if I'm remembering my dates correctly here, stood up in 2010, it was decided that the head of the NSA should also be the head of Cyber Command. That if you're going to use electronic means to spy, but you're also going to carry out electronic warfare, not electronic warfare, it's cyber warfare. Yep. It makes sense to have one person as the head of that. And it was always sort of envisioned to be temporary. But here we are 15 years later, and it's still there. Now, it almost ended under the Obama administration, and then it was seemingly put to bed during Trump. But then to the last hour, 11th hour, talking about 11th hour with Cyber Command 2.0, December 2020, there was this push inside the Pentagon to split the hat.
Split it up. Yep.
And it eventually, time ran out. There was enough resistance from General Nakasone and General Mark Milley, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs at the time, and it just sort of went nowhere. Meanwhile, then you go flash to the Biden administration, and they pick former Joint Chiefs Chairman Joe Dunford to lead a small group of Cyber Command people, DOJ, only 4 members on this team, small group.
Which included a skeptic.
It did.
Split, right?
It did. Yes,
it
did. And no, the picks were interesting. Those who have followed the issue, and the report, the findings are classified, but as General Nakasone has referred to in public testimony, they found quote unquote substantial benefits to having one person doing both of these missions, heading both of these organizations. And that's sort of where it's been. Now we're in Trump 2.0, and I reported back in December that advisors who were in the orbit of the transition are proposing to split the dual hat once again. Now, to the arguments for and against. The arguments for are that having one person do that makes us fast, agile, and lethal. You can't have someone at NSA say, "Oh, this is interesting," and then walk down the hallway to the Cyber Command and be like, "Hey, have you seen this? Oh, okay, maybe we should do this. What do you think? I don't know. What do you think?" And that sort of thing. But then you have other people who say that the jobs are just too big for one person to do. And there's also, if we're being honest, there are large swaths of the intelligence community who are not comfortable having a uniformed military officer as the head of the biggest U.S. spy agency. Never have been, never will be. So, there's apparently this sort of push. Now, Secretary Hegseth, in his written questions to Congress, said that he would bring a conclusion to this debate. There is something in law that you can split the dual hat if there's a certification done by the SecDef and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it's signed off on the president. Has to look at certain issues. But in terms of how that's done, the process is vague. I mentioned the Dunford review. That's how Biden chose to do it. He got Joe Dunford in because Joe Dunford was well respected, can cut through the red tape quickly. But what does it look like in Trump 2.0? No one can really say. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the upcoming defense bills, my money would be on the Senate more than the House, that they might layer in some things like these certain officials have to look at it too. There has to be a 180-day review before you turn in a report. You can't just, someone I talked to for the story in December said Trump could just take out a piece of paper that says Office of the President on it, slide across the desk, and have the 2 guys sign off on it, and that's the review. Because it can be that vague. So, and the reason this might appeal to President Trump is with his promise to break up or sort of revamp the Pentagon and the intelligence community, it would allow him to pick an NSA chief. And while General Hawk would probably it's not a demotion, he'd probably just be fine shunting off their NSA responsibilities. Trump might turn to him and say, "You're a Biden guy, and you're gone too." So he might have his own 4-star Cyber Command and his own chief at NSA, civilian chief at NSA, and that's appealing to someone like President Trump, I feel.
One of the things I struggle with, because if you had asked me over 8 years ago, I actually had this was a theme for my students to debate, and it was their final project that they had to do when I was teaching at GW many years ago. And there are strong arguments on both sides. 10 years ago, I think we didn't lean forward. So the guys and gals who stole secrets for a living never wanted to compromise an exquisite means or a technique or a 0 day or whatever fun terminology we want to use. So the I got a secret world was running circles around the Title 10 combat world. I think we're seeing a slight shift in that. And the question I have is, do we have the men and women to be able to provide for the intelligence? Here's the bottom line. NSA is a combat support command for all the other COCOMs.
Yes.
Special Operations Command, Central Command, Africa Command, Europe, etc., Pacific, obviously. But do we have the people is the question. It seems like we're struggling. We're all fishing from one pond, and I'm okay with the intellectual argument almost either way.
Yeah.
Smarter people than me can come up with that.
Right.
What I don't want is to stymie our ability to do things.
Right.
And if it slows down, if you want a more lethal Pentagon, you better have the capability to do that.
Right, exactly. In terms of the workforce, I mean, the whole dual hat debate, especially now that this might happen, is this opens Pandora's box for questions. If you were to go to NSA right now and sit at a table like this one with 10 other people from Fort Meade, if we went like, who are you with NSA? Who are you with Cyber Command? Who are you with NSA? How do you start separating those people out?
Yeah.
How do you start paying for those billets on either side, or for those salaries on either side? And it's Pandora's box. I was talking to members of Congress when I was writing the transition story, and they're like, no one has thought this through. If you do this, like, no one has thought this through. Now, one argument that has started to fall flat a little bit is Cyber Command saps, money and resources and people from NSA. That's getting better, I feel like. U.S. Cyber Command has been given budget-like authorities, or service-like authorities, I should say, set their own budget, so they reimburse NSA for manpower hours and things like that. So that argument's sort of starting to sound a little hollow. But in terms of like, how do you take these two apart? How do you keep the right people in there? How do you attract people? No one's thought this through.
And ensure you don't lose capability.
Exactly.
Because this is Frank Cillufo's opinion. I'm not putting words in Martin's mouth here, but we've got to defend forward. At the end of the day, we're not going to defend and firewall our way out of this problem. The question is, where are we going to get that capacity, and how long will it take, and will it impact our ability to have the outcomes we hope to have, both in the cyber domain and every other domain that cyber touches?
Right. That's what the evaluation is supposed to look at. But again, it's so vague that, Secretary has got to just be like, no, it's fine. Everything's fine. But then like, okay, so like how does this work? Like, no one really knows. And, it is interesting for, Trump and Doge, even though it had two heads at first, now it's on to one head, government efficiency. And now you're going to take one person's job and put in a two, and you're going to separate all these other people's jobs. And the domino effect, the cascading effect from that is
interesting. Never thought about it from that perspective. Did Secretary Hegseth give any indication during his confirmation hearings? I didn't track him as closely as he did.
I will say I sat through that whole hearing, and the word cyber was not uttered once. So that was kind of a bummer. But like I said, in his written questions, which are available online, if you go to the SASC, he said he would bring it to a conclusion, and he would bring it quickly. So whatever you want to read into that, you can read into that. But I would say in his hearing, he didn't really show much of a indication one way or another, or an indication to disagree with the president on certain national security issues. So if this is something that President Trump tried to do in his first administration, and people are advising you do this administration, it all sort of adds up to like, now again, not to lead the witness, to use your phrase, it leads up to like, it might be, the dual hat might be over, as we know it might be over.
And again, I'm agnostic as long as capability is, and I hope that is part of the deliberative decision.
And I'm agnostic because I'm a reporter. So
true that. So let's jump to another topic, and you've done some really interesting reporting, and I didn't see many others report on this, and it's more looking at the broader role of State Department and former Ambassador Nate Fick in terms of, and I don't think we have a nominee for the current role, but but sort of looking at the diplomatic role of cyber. And most interestingly, I thought you wrote a phenomenal piece on FALCON. And rather than steal your thunder, I'll let you talk about that. So.
Sure. Well, FALCON, please don't ask me to spell out that acronym.
Yeah. Not a worry.
I know forward assistance is the first two, but after that, I am lost. So there's the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the State Department. It's not even 3 years old. I think April is its birthday. In the past couple of years, they have spent, since being established, doing the pick and spade work of what capabilities can we, the State Department, bring forward, and how can we, potentially win hearts, influence minds through cyber diplomacy. I had a story. You have it up right now. They had about 9 programs back in September. I think that might change in the future. But the premier one that they're talking about is FALCON. And what this is cyber incident rapid response, and not just by the State Department. They are bringing along the private sector to do this. That's the story I wrote just a couple weeks ago, or was it last week? Time is a flat circle. But about
Costa Rica.
Costa Rica, yes. Costa Rica was the first use of FALCON.
That one in a second.
So what happened was the day before Thanksgiving, there it is. Recope, which is the state-owned oil refiner for Costa Rica, realized they were under ransomware attack. Now we had helped.
And Costa Rica paid a big price in the past.
Yes. We helped them out with Conti back in 2022. They were down for months. The whole government was down for months. Really down. Like writing
down
things. Exactly. Pen and paper operations throughout. So they realized they're under cyber attack on Wednesday. They call Ambassador Fick saying we need help. By Thanksgiving night, you have a couple State Department employees and people from 2 private sector companies on their way down to Costa Rica to help. I mean, you're talking like 30.
Like a go team.
Exactly. It's like 36 hours down to Costa Rica. They were down there maybe 10, 12 days, then some virtual help after that. There's still some virtual assistance going on. But for all that, to get them back online, and by the way, they avoided a catastrophic. This would have been catastrophic if they couldn't get these systems back online. As it was, some tanker trucks were backed up at oil stations, some payments had to be processed. But like Recope is the only company in the country that can handle airplane fuel, that can handle the fuel that's being brought in from the ports, things like that. So it's all just, it could have been terrible.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
A really bad day.
It was a strategic target by the ransomware operators. Absolutely. So,
and does this bias love, and I don't mean to be so blatant in that, but I think at the end of the day, bringing something unique to the table to help others will pay dividends in other diplomatic areas. Yes, no?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the whole point, is by showing up as a friend. Genuinely as a friend, because I mean, isn't that one of the knocks on China's foreign policy over the years, is they always want something in return.
Transactional.
Transactional. So if we're showing up as a friend and helping you out, and by the way, this whole operation cost probably like less than $1 million. I think that's a good news story. I talked to people down in Costa Rica who were like, this is exactly how programs like this, how cyber diplomacy, cyber foreign assistance should work. And by keeping at it over time on a variety of fronts, not just FALCON, like I said, there are 9 programs. FALCON's one of them. The U.S. demonstrates its value on key issues that we might not have in the past, or that China might have traditionally.
Awesome. So you brought up China. How do you think we could look at this strategically to maybe counter the CCP's influence? And I think by and large it is much more transactional, but if you have lots of transactions, that makes for a tough environment to push back on.
I think I agree with you there. So I think, maybe there is a little something not so altruistic about this policy, because one of the efforts is about laying undersea cable, something that's become a massive target around the globe. They're being cut all the time in Europe, and now
Swedes are getting pretty vocal on this, right?
They are. Yeah. It's becoming an issue. Some of my colleagues have covered this very well, for the record. But one of the first use of the undersea cable was in a little South Pacific nation called Tuvalu, and it's a little island in South Pacific, but they didn't have an undersea cable before. Now they do, thanks to the U.S. Not only the U.S., it was a multilateral mission with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and us. So now it's like, not only is the U.S. showing up to be your friend, but your neighbors are showing up to be your friend. And then another thing that I mentioned in the Recope story is another effort is about training others on malware threats, or about other online threats. So they held workshops for members of the Vietnamese government about various North Korean online threats and how to handle them, what to look for, things like that. So sharing that knowledge is also helpful.
And just to maybe help some of our viewers and listeners. Undersea, a lot rides over these cables, right? Can you and at the end of the day, it's irrelevant whether you do something through cyber means or you use a kinetic, more traditional IED or whatever it may be, or anchor to take out a critical infrastructure. But just for our viewers and listeners, most people don't think of undersea. They see space, they see land, obviously, they see cyber. But what can you help us just?
I would say, in addition to those examples you just gave about space and sea, I would say that undersea cables are part of the backbone.
They are the backbone.
They are the backbone for connectivity in the world, especially to small island nations. And if you're talking about the South Pacific, you're talking about a lot of nations out there that without these cables are not going to be able to have connectivity, which, I mean, take away connectivity. We're talking about, top of the conversation here about Typhoon, the catastrophic damage that could have been done if they decided to just flip a switch, and all of a sudden, like, you can't, gas stations don't work or something like that. Imagine that, like, not having connectivity, like, fill in the blank about how bad that could get. Like, can you send a distress call? Like, can you defend your country?
Makes a bad situation worse.
Exactly.
The potential for that in itself, it's a bad situation. Now, there seem to have been, maybe we're just paying more attention, maybe we're being a little more vocal about it, but I feel like we've seen a lot more incidents of trawlers and potentially, allegedly, commercial shippers accidentally taking out undersea cables.
It does seem to be on the rise, and I think that's one of the reasons why this is now a State Department program to take care of this, or not to
both
sort of
Russia
address,
and China.
Russia and China, yes, is the State Department is seeing this rise happen, and undersea cables are not cheap. Like, we couldn't afford that. Like, well, not I say we, I said the U.S. alone couldn't afford to, like, start funding undersea cable projects all around the world. But if we can work in strategic areas like the South Pacific or in parts of Europe,
Nordic,
with other partners, make it multilateral. Again, that shows the value that the U.S. brings and gives an alternative to what a country might
turning to China.
Yeah, rather than turning to China. Yeah.
So, last question, and it's one that I don't love talking about, but norms. You've written some interesting pieces there, and here's the truth. At the very least, it should be a do no harm.
Right.
If you've got 100 diplomats from one country and we're bringing one, that's not an even playing field. But what are your thoughts there?
I think that they have a lot of work. I think the State Department has a lot of work to do. I think that the Bureau is only less than 3 years old. Like I said, they have no...
Do they have the resources, you think?
I think they do. I think that because of the 2022 CHIPS Act and then their baseline budget, and then Congress has set up the Bureau specifically with like a $15 million reservoir of money, they have a chance to at least get out the gate. Now, whether that is sustainable over the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see. I wrote this weekend that the cyber diplomacy funding is basically on hold, as we found out this morning. A lot of things are on hold all of a sudden. So, but that one seems to be clear that Secretary Rubio is doing a 90-day review, and if you're looking to counter China, if that's what the stated goal of the administration is to compete and compete against China. These seem like
you need all the instruments.
You need all the instruments, and you need all these programs. But again, agnostic, just a reporter. But it's like, if this is your stated goal, and I'm looking at what these programs do,
we don't know what the outcome of that is.
We do not.
Yeah, but so Martin, you've covered a lot of amazing territory here. Any other pieces in particular or questions I should have asked that I didn't?
That's funny. It's usually one of the last questions I ask in interviews is like, are you scratching your head about like, why hasn't he asked me about this yet? But I mean, I think that one thing that we're definitely keeping an eye on, I think a lot of people are, is cyber nominees. We have none. We have no CISA chief. We have no
national cyber director.
We have no national cyber director. So we don't know whether, Ann Neuberger was the head of cyber for the NSC.
How the NSC is going to handle
how it's going to handle. We still just don't know. And I was thinking about the other day about how much guff the Biden administration came under for not naming an NCD, this is back during Colonial Pipeline, not naming NCD for a couple of months and things like that, and not having a CISA director in place. But here we are, we're dealing with these Typhoon hacks, we're dealing with all these other things that we've talked about, and we're just not seeing, we're seeing names on the ether, but they've been on the ether for the better part of 5-6 months now, and there seems to be no hard timeline to get these people in at state, at CISA, at DOD. We'll just sort of see. So I think that's something to really pay attention to.
And just to double down and emphasize cyber matters. So at the end of the day, if you went through a whole confirmation hearing and couldn't have one drink when they say cyber, if that's a drinking game, that's also shame on. It's a broader set of issues.
It is. I will admit my secret heart here. I was a little disappointed in Senators King and Rounds. I was like, here come my guys. They're going to ask the cyber question, and they didn't come around. And I was like, oh, so then once that happens, like, then I don't think we're going to hear about it. So turned into the questions, and that's where I found the dual hat answer. But because cyber matters, I just don't know, with the administration's priorities on immigration and fiscal policy and whatnot, I just don't know when we're going to see these people.
Martin, continue shining light on big, important issues. I hope we'll have you on again, either on the podcast or in a different format. And thank you for fighting the good fight and making us smarter. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.